and welcome to our second Share Your Green Design Masterclass. For those of you who are not familiar with our platform, Share Your Green Design is a digital ecosystem of exemplary case studies, research, methodologies, and ideas that showcase sustainable architecture design from around the world. Our mission is to substantially reduce the industry carbon footprint by providing architects, engineers, and all construction professionals with the knowledge that they need. Masterclass is our newest section in Share Green Design. This is a space where we invite top experts from very specific topics related to sustainability in the built environment, decarbonization, health and well-being in buildings, and much more. Today, our special guest is Oliver Kinnane. Oliver is an associate professor at the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy in University College Dublin, and academic lead of the Building in a Climate Emergency Research Lab there. He is founder and director of the MSc in Architecture, Urbanism and Climate Action. His research is focused on building construction, conservation and operation, and improving the performance of the built environment at large. He has written over 100 peer-reviewed published articles on these topics and has multiple funded research projects, including 4 Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland RD&D projects, agrothermal testing of traditional building fabrics, evaluating heat pump performance in use, investigating models of compact urban growth, and analyzing the performance of NZEB buildings. He has also a project on building vacancy funded by the EPT, and a project on viable homes funded by Construct Innovate, which is outlining carbon guidelines for planners and developers. He has a H2020 project pro bono, and he's leading the world whole life carbon in Irish construction sector and built environment study with Dr. Richard O'Gerty for the Irish Green Building Council. Today, Oliver will talk about avoiding having to retrofit the retrofits, how to get retrofit right the first time, how to make sure we can use retrofit as a tool to enable reuse and to stop demolition of our built heritage, understand buildings better, understand what materials work for what type of buildings, and understand the potentials and limitations of new technologies for retrofit. We'll have a Q&A session after this presentation, so please post all your comments and questions in the chat in whichever platform you are streaming from, YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and we will go through as many as we can. And as a last reminder, we will be recording this session and we'll post it later on our channels for your review. So it's over to you, Oliver.
Thanks, Bethany. Hi, everyone. I am just going to share my presentation and get up and running. So hopefully now you're seeing my presentation. So I just want to start by saying thank you very much to Share Your Green Design for inviting me to present as part of the Masterclass series. I know this is the second one. I watched Kelly's on the first one and thoroughly enjoyed it and found it very educational myself. I think Share Your Green Design is a great initiative and happy to support it. And a particular thanks to Juan Morillas, who is, of course, very much involved in Share Your Green Design, has been a great support to me here in UCD and to our educational offering here, getting involved in a number of the modules that I run at master's level here in University College Dublin at the School of Architecture, where I'm currently based. So the title of my talk today is Careful Now, Let's Avoid Retrofitting Today's Retrofits. But I just want to start with a kind of a quick plug for what I do here in UCD and introduce you particularly to the MSc in Architecture, Urbanism and Climate Action that Bethany mentioned. I run this with my colleague, Dr. Philip Crowe here at UCD. And a lot of the content, say, of what I cover today and lots more is part of that master's program. I'm also lead of the Building in a Climate Emergency Research Group with my colleague, Dr. Richard O'Hegarty, who is a research lead in the group. And a lot of the projects I'll talk about today are run from within that that group. So we have a website, and you can check us out on the UCD website and check out the range of projects we have and the associated publications. And today, particularly, I'm going to talk, particularly initially, I'm going to talk about this big project we're doing for the Irish Green Building Council, which is the whole life carbon in construction and the built environment in Ireland, where we were essentially given the brief to quantify the impact, the carbon impact of building and constructing the built environment and the operation of the built environment year on year here in Ireland. And this is one of many projects that we have in the Building and Climate Emergency Research Group. We have projects around near zero energy buildings. We've projects around historic building fabrics, around heat pumps, modeling compact urban growth, and different typologies of urban growth. We're working with local councils on European projects to develop green building neighbourhoods. And then we were working with the Environmental Protection Agency on the revitalisation of towns and properties within those towns. And the work that I present today is really it's a team effort. There's many people both at postdoctoral level, research fellow level, and a big team of PhD students working together on these projects to try and deliver and direct us in how we achieve these very ambitious targets that we've set to 2030 and all the way out to 2050. And I suppose one theme that links all of these projects together is the idea of retrofit. And retrofit is what I'll be talking about today. And I suppose the title of the talk, The Careful Now, Let's Avoid Retrofitting Today's Retrofit, really stems from this event or this appearance that I made last year when I was invited onto a parliamentary committee here in Ireland, what we call the Oireachtas committees. And there I was invited on to talk about the whole life carbon in construction, particularly the embodied carbon of construction of the Irish built environment. And flippantly, at one point during conversation, I predicted that we'll end up retrofitting today's retrofits within 10 years. And that statement actually was probably the only thing that was reported from the whole appearance that I made, and was met with a high level of hysteria in the media that kind of caught me off guard. And today, I suppose I want to make that comment and why I would say something like that, kind of the topic of the presentation. So why is it that we might end up retrofitting today's retrofits? Why do we need to be careful when we retrofit buildings? And it's not to say that I'm in any way against retrofit. I totally believe and back these campaigns that call for retrofit and reuse of our built environment. I think it's actually probably the most important strategy that we have and that we know to reduce the carbon emissions associated with our built environment, both in construction and in the operation of our built environment. But I do think we need to be careful. And why I'm going to, through a number of different kind of topics today, talk about why we do need to be careful. And I think the first reason we do need to be careful when we talk about retrofit and when we do retrofit is because really we can't afford many goes at this. We all know, we all live in countries which have ambitious targets. Here in Ireland, we have very ambitious targets to reduce our carbon emissions by over 50% by 2030. So in a very short time horizon of 6.5 years, we're due to cut our carbon emissions in half and then reduce to net zero by 2050. And if you look at any of these kind of guidance documents from any of the IEA or the European Union or any of the world bodies, and here I just chose one from the World Energy Outlook report that came out last year, many of them use as a key strategy is the reduction of energy within buildings, and particularly and achieving that through retrofit of buildings. Here, by 2040, 50% of existing buildings are to be retrofit to zero carbon ready levels around the globe. In Ireland, as I say, that reduction is over 50% by 2030, and these are the sectoral, the individual sectoral ceilings that have been set. So it's 45% reduction in energy in commercial and public buildings, and a 40% reduction in residential buildings. And that then is aligned with a massive introduction of renewable energy sources onto our grid, changing from our very densely fossil fuel grid with high levels of carbon emissions currently to a renewable energy grid, and I suppose using that electricity then to power our buildings, and thereby marrying the two strategies of a clean energy source with a reduced demand and an electrical demand, and thereby achieving a 51% reduction by 2030. That's been Richard O'Hegarty and I at the Building in a Climate Emergency Research Group, do a lot of modelling study about whether these ambitious targets are actually achievable. And we look at strategies and policies that are introduced by the government, and we predict whether those strategies and policies will actually achieve these ambitious targets. And I direct you to these papers that I reference here in the slides. They are actually published. I know it says it's undergoing final review in this case. It has been accepted and has been published. But this graph here shows the expectation for the residential sector in Ireland. So by 2030, we're supposed to reduce to about 5 megatons of CO2 equivalents. But if we continue at the levels of retrofit that we do today, we're going to miss that target quite dramatically. We'll be only hit about 86% above target level. And we really, really need to actually achieve those targets of a reduction in operational carbon. Because in Ireland, like in many countries, our population is increasing. We have already and forever a housing crisis, and we need to solve that housing crisis by building homes. And that building of homes is actually going to bring significant embodied carbon with it. So we really need to reduce the amount of energy or the amount of carbon related to the operation of our buildings if we're going to I suppose, create space in our carbon budgets for this additional carbon that's going to essentially negate the achievements in the reduction of the operational carbon. If we look at the built environment more broadly, what our studies have shown, and our major paper, I suppose, in this field is the whole life carbon quantification of the built environment case study Ireland, which was published in Building and Environment in 2022 and is available on Science Direct. What we showed through a range of accounting measures is that the built environment in Ireland is equal or accounts for 37% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So it's as big as any other sector in the country. It says in Ireland we have a very big agricultural sector, and it's much maligned, and that sector is itself 37% of emissions. So the built environment is as big as the other big sector in this country. And that 37%, which is almost, more or less what other countries have reported, maybe not in as great detail as we have in Ireland, but many countries around the world are somewhere between 30 and 40% of their overall emissions are related to the built environment. In Ireland, that is split 1/3, 2/3 between the construction and maintenance of the built environment year on year and the operation of the built environment. So really, I suppose the key point is that the operational emissions are really the majority share, accounting for 2/3 of all carbon emissions related to the built environment in this country. So therefore, to reduce the overall impact of the built environment, we really need in the first place to reduce the operational emissions related to our buildings. And retrofit is a key strategy for this. And in Ireland, we have a national retrofit policy that says that we should retrofit up to 500,000 of our homes. That's over 25% of our homes by 2030. So it's a massive increase on the amount of retrofit that we're carrying out today. So my point, I suppose, is that if we're going to achieve and carry out all of this retrofit, we really need to get it right. We'll end up adding lots of materials to these buildings, and we will have to make sure that we do get it right and that we get it right first time. And that's because the embodied carbon of retrofit is not insignificant. We often think that new buildings, the building of new buildings is the carbon heavy choice in the built environment, and that retrofit and reuse of buildings is not and is the better choice. But what I'm saying here is that the reuse and retrofit of buildings brings significant carbon emissions itself. And we've quantified this through looking at a couple of different case study buildings. This is one example of small 40-metre squared social housing in the southeast of Ireland, which were retrofit. These are cast concrete one-bedroom homes, retrofit using external wall insulation, renewable PV panels on the rooftops, heat pump technologies, each home getting an individual heat pump, which is questionable, but also windows and building fabric retrofit. And what we see is that the embodied carbon of all of this addition of materials and technologies brings a significant embodied carbon total with it, up to somewhere between 250 and 300 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared of floor area. So that's really quite significant. If we look at the academic literature, and particularly in the A boundaries of LCA analysis, we're often looking at an embodied carbon of new homes somewhere between 800 and 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So, retrofit is somewhere around 25-30% of the impact of new build. Extrapolating that out to a kind of a more standard Irish home, this kind of semi-detached home that's built on the edge of Irish towns and Irish cities and creates this continuous urban sprawl of our urban environments. And that's a whole nother topic, and we have research projects that look at the alternative choices to development in this country and beyond. But again, we see that these kind of homes bring significant embodied carbon of over 100 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared of built floor area. I mean, if we look at Ireland's carbon emissions over the last kind of decades, or say all the way back to, in this case, back to 1922, when Ireland won its independence, became an independent state. We see some areas where really we added a lot of housing, and the construction, the fingerprint of that construction of our built environment is very much evident in the overall carbon emissions of Ireland. In studies that we've done, we've traced the development of that built environment by looking at the amount of materials that were consumed at different times through that construction. So around 2006 in Ireland, we had a huge construction boom that ultimately led to a big economic collapse. That can be kind of seen here in this graph, where we look at the different materials that were used in the construction of the built environment at that what we call the Celtic Tiger development period. We used a lot of concrete. Almost 40% of our emissions came from concrete. About another 40% came from metals, so that's the importation of metals in Ireland. We don't produce any metals, aluminium or iron or steel anymore, so we import those emissions from elsewhere. So in a consumption-based emissions accounting, we can see that both concrete and aluminium and other metals add up to about 80% of our overall embodied carbon of the materials that we use to develop our built environment. And this is what Ireland looked like at that stage in 2006. There was construction happening everywhere. Never before in the history of Ireland have we actually built so many buildings at any given time, or we've never actually got back to building the same number of houses and homes as we did back then. But the reality is that, you know, how many years later is it? It's less than 20 years later. Many of these buildings are already being retrofit. And in certain cases, and particularly in this image along the quays in Dublin, we're already seeing a number of these buildings being demolished, setting up this kind of very unsustainable attitude or development of our built environment. I think another reason we need to be careful when we talk about retrofit is because when we do retrofit, we don't always get it right. And we as a research group do a lot of post-occupancy evaluation of buildings. And again, looking at those one-bedroom small social housing scheme, we wrote a paper on that particular scheme. They were all designed to be retrofit from F and G ratings, so very, very low building energy ratings, very poor building energy performance. They were all designed to be retrofit to an A2 standard. So that's less than 25 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. What we saw when we went back into those homes post retrofit is that very few of them are performing at that standard. Although you would expect that these homes, you know, they're small, simple homes to retrofit, and we'd expect to achieve those rating levels. In fact, many of the homes were operating in B categories and even in certain cases in C categories. And we see this across a lot of the homes that we monitor. Going back to the national retrofit policy of 500,000 homes, an additional policy or part of our climate action plan here in Ireland is to add over 680,000 heat pumps by 2030. So not only are we retrofitting 500,000 homes, we're adding heat pumps to all of those homes and changing out the fossil fuel heating systems of those homes to electric heating systems, plus more heating systems into new buildings that are going to be built. We do a lot of work. We've had a number of projects where we've looked at heat pumps in use in near zero energy buildings or new and retrofit buildings. And what we see in some cases, and actually in many cases, is that heat pumps are performing well below the levels that manufacturers claim they'll perform at. So if in this graphic, the red dot is the declared performance by the manufacturer, so the coefficient of performance, and that's plotted here for the temperature difference between the flow temperature within the heating system and the outdoor ambient air temperature. What we see when we look at the grey dots, which are actually the in-use performance for a year of operation, is that the in-use performance is well below the optimum performance line as declared by the manufacturer. What we really see on average is that coefficients of performance of heat pumps are somewhere around 2.5, with manufacturers claiming 3.5 and 4 and even above in newer technologies today. And this performance gap is actually seen in a lot of studies that have been done, particularly studies done by UCL, who work with large data sets. And they've seen a low performance as well for heat pumps. And this is something I think we really need to be aware of, particularly if we're going to mass roll out this technology between now and 2030. We need to learn how to install these technologies correctly. We need to learn how to operate these technologies correctly. We need to inform occupants of buildings, and particularly home occupants, as to how to operate these new kind of heating systems that operate with much lower operational temperatures than old fossil fuel boiler systems. And so we need to educate particularly homeowners in how to operate them most efficiently. Another test study that we did when we looked at retrofit homes was to use heat flux sensors and to attach these to the building envelopes to understand the heat flow or the heat loss through these building fabrics post-retrofit in some cases, and also in new builds. But what we see in many cases, and particularly in the retrofit examples, is again a performance gap. underperformance of these building envelopes relative to the designed for performance. And I suppose I'm highlighting these things, or I think that these kind of results are significant because we are carrying out a huge amount of retrofit, and we're increasing the rates of retrofit year on year in this country and around Europe and all across the world. But there's actually very little study of whether this retrofit is actually working, if we're actually achieving these efficiencies that we think we're achieving. This is a call, I think, and I always make this call for much greater funding of research into buildings, and particularly as we move towards these, mass strategies to try and reduce the impact of our built environment. We need to check. We need to make sure that the strategies that we're choosing are actually most appropriate and actually working for our benefit. Highlighted here in this table, and I direct people to the paper if you're interested, is a number of building envelopes that we tested, many of them showing underperformance, oftentimes by multiples, up in some cases to 200%, 300% over the designed for performance. We're still working through finite element modelling studies and further on-site testing, although oftentimes it's quite difficult to get into the building fabric and start tearing it apart to really figure out why these retrofits, the fabric retrofits, are not working as they should be. But what we're beginning to see through our modelling studies and our on-site studies is that in a lot of cases, when we're adding insulation to building fabrics, we're creating gaps between the fabric and the insulation, and gaps between the insulation layers. And what we actually see is convective currents or air currents in and around the insulation, very much undermining the value of the insulation in reducing the conductive heat loss through the thermal transmittance of the building. Lots more care is required when we retrofit our buildings, I think, is the conclusion of that study. Another point I'd like to make, I think, when I say we need to be careful about when we do retrofit, we need to be careful because we still don't really know that and nearly enough about buildings. As I say, we do very little post-occupancy evaluation study of our retrofit buildings. So we really only have small pieces of information about the actual post-retrofit performance of buildings. And our knowledge of building physics around buildings is still very much at a nascent stage. Buildings are really complex heat transfer systems, increasingly so as we add new technologies to these buildings. And we really need to start learning and researching buildings. In Ireland, the focus really of our building regulations has been very singularly focused on the building fabric and continually reducing the U value of that building fabric. It's now 0.21. I think actually even for residential buildings, it might even be 0.18 watts per meter squared Kelvin now. That has reduced, that U value requirement has reduced continuously with every new iteration of building regulations that has been since they were first introduced in the late 1970s. What that has meant is that the majority of retrofit, and particularly fabric retrofit, is focused on adding insulation to the building fabric. And that is okay in the situation of contemporary buildings, where each layer has a particular requirement or a particular purpose, and there are weathering layers to ensure that water doesn't transmit into the building fabric. But so that's the image on the left is the contemporary building fabric. The image on the right is the traditional building fabric, and 1 in 6 of our buildings in Ireland are built as using this or similar kind of fabrics, with stone and clay and materials that were dug up from around the country, different kinds of materials, resulting in quite different kind of fabrics from around the island of Ireland. And Ireland, I think, is a particular case study as an island on the I suppose the west front of Europe, very much an Atlantic storm kind of impacted island. And what we see is that we have a lot of rain in Ireland. It's not raining today, but it's not far off it. And I bet you it's raining out the west of Ireland. We get high levels of rain along the west coast, and we get high levels of wind-driven rain particularly, and that's shown in the bottom left image here. And what that means is that we get a lot of moisture in our building fabrics. And then when we go to look at what we call our DEEP, which is our assessment methodology, so how we rate our buildings in Ireland, we don't actually have particular or specific U values for buildings built before 1970. In Ireland, those buildings for different typologies of construction are just given default U values. So what happens in that situation is that when we rate these kind of traditional and older and historic buildings, they often come out, or they're often given a building energy rating, a very low building energy rating, and the homeowner rushes to insulate those buildings, and they do so using materials that are often not appropriate for buildings with moisture in the building fabric. So we have a project here in UCD called the FabTrads project, supported by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland and further by the Department of Housing in Ireland, where we're testing the wide range of historic and traditional building fabrics. And what we see when we do in situ testing is that we see many of these walls kind of performing with better characteristics than we might presume. Not all of them, many actually, particularly in the case of high levels of saturated walls, we see poor performance, but in many cases these walls are performing better than the default value. I suppose the conclusion is that maybe we don't need to rush to insulate these buildings if they're performing better than we expect. Certainly, we shouldn't be rushing to insulate these buildings using materials that are inappropriate for the long-term sustainability and preservation of these kind of buildings. Because what happens when we add these materials of say impermeable materials is we get buildup of moisture and risk of mold growth within the walls. And we're testing these kind of hydrothermal properties in the laboratory to try and see for different brick types and different stone types in Ireland what the uptake of water is. And we do that through a wide range of tests of thermal conductivity and of different moisture transmittance mechanisms through these kind of building materials. And what we're trying to do in this FabTrads project is we're going to try and develop data sheets for all the wide range of building materials in the historic and traditional building fabrics, and to bring that database of materials into the WFI hydrothermal software, where designers and architects can go to this software, select the Irish material database, select the materials with the measured properties of those materials in the Irish context, and use those to model for thermal and hydrothermal movements in the building fabric. And I'm not going to get into detail on these kind of modeling studies. This project is again just a year old, and we're very much trying to work through it and develop the kind of, these are only preliminary results which I'm showing. But what we do see is very high levels of risk of mold growth within traditional buildings when we use materials that are inappropriate, particularly for moisture transmittance. So when we use impermeable insulation projects such as PIR board or phenolic foam or any of those kind of polymer-based installations, which are being pushed continuously in the drive to reduce U values and create more energy efficient buildings, we see high risks of mold growth at the interface between the building fabric and the insulation. I suppose another reason we need to be careful when we talk about retrofit or when we do retrofit is because in my mind, to ensure from a whole life carbon perspective that we don't continue on the wrong path. We don't want retrofit to add to the case for demolition of buildings that are presumed to be inefficient. And that's in Dublin, as in many countries around, or many cities around Europe and around the country, we're seeing a number of buildings being torn down and replaced, and that the service life of buildings is forever shortening, and this is happening more and more. In quite a significant site here in Dublin City, where Grafton Architects have added a lovely new headquarters for our electricity supply board. This is an example of a site which has seen 3 iterations of buildings in a 60-year period. It went from being the world's longest street of Georgian buildings. They were demolished in the 1960s to be replaced with a modernist precast concrete building then, and that was torn down subsequently in 2018 to be replaced by the Grafton Architects faux Georgian building that is in place today with an unknown lifetime ahead. Hopefully it'll last a long time. But this kind of cycle of demolition and rebuild and demolition and rebuild is ongoing all over the city, and we're losing gems of particularly our modernist built heritage and to be replaced with buildings of much greater floor area, buildings oftentimes of glass facades that are operating with very high energy loads, both heating and cooling loads throughout the year. And these buildings really embody significant amount of carbon dioxide. Another example of buildings that my colleagues Ellen Rowley and Philip Crowe are evaluating in a lot of detail are Catholic churches in Ireland. We went through a phase of building a lot of churches back in between the 1960s and 1980s, and with reductions in congregations today, we see a lot of these buildings become obsolete and hence are being demolished. And with their demolition, we're losing significant quantities of carbon dioxide. Just recognizing that the unit here is incorrect. That should be kilograms of CO2 as opposed to tons of CO2, but over a million of those lost in this part of the superstructure of the building before we even account for the substructure of the building. And what's happening in the case of these kind of commercial and residential buildings that are being demolished is that the developers are claiming that they're not easily retrofit. In this case, they're saying that retention is not necessarily more sustainable than demolition and rebuild. And based on this inspector's report, this building, which is mightn't be everybody's cup of tea, but it is actually one of the few modern buildings we have of that time period. This building was torn down as a result of this report. And really, these buildings are easily retrofit. We can quite easily, concrete frame, brick upstand, window replacement, can quite easily be retrofit, saving the sunk carbon that exists in the building, and allowing these buildings live for much more sustainable lives into the future. If we save these buildings, and this building here on the right is again an example of a modern building in Ireland, Liberty Hall on the Quays, and anybody who has visited Dublin will have seen this building. This building was scheduled for demolition back in the early 2010s. Again, due to work by Docomomo and colleagues of mine here in UCD, this building was retained, and as a result, it operates, or it continues to live today and function as the headquarters of one of the trade unions in the country. It needs to be retrofit, certainly, to improve its performance. But by stopping that demolition and hopefully retrofitting that building sooner rather than later, we've stopped this cycle where we're continually adding carbon by adding a new building and letting that building live for ever shorter service lives, and then demolishing that building and continuing this cycle of demolition and rebuild. So we need to do retrofit. I think the point I'm trying to make through this talk is that we just need to learn how to do it right. And we need to do that so that we can get on this path to net zero by 2050. Because if we don't learn how to do retrofit right, we haven't a hope of meeting these targets. And really, I think it's what's required to achieve that, particularly for us, people who work in the built environment, is a lot more care, a lot more research, a lot more knowledge into buildings, into building materials, into building operation, into the patterns of occupancy and the people who use our homes and our technologies within those homes, and a lot of collaboration across different fields and different people working across the built environment. And then we might get on a path to net zero by 2050. So thank you. That's my talk.
Thank you, Oliver. This was very insightful presentation. Yes, highlighting how important it is to retrofit the existing buildings, but also to be smart when we first build them, and how we, every decision that we put into the building, how important it is, and we have a big challenge at the moment in the industry. But I also want to highlight what you mentioned about so how to make informed decisions, right? Because how important it is to bring together academics, researchers, and innovators, but also the industry experts and policymakers, and even the homeowners who are the ones who are going to be using the building in the end. So if we create a very efficient building, but then in the end we keep the windows open while we have the heating on, it's for nothing, right? So
yeah,
yes, and about the importance of informed decisions and the importance of having data sets and the importance of having data about buildings, about building systems, new technologies, old technologies, the tradition in construction, and also the materials, the new materials and existing ones. So yeah, I think that's major importance. And yeah, that brings us also to the main goal of shared green design. Is actually sharing and bringing different people together with their knowledge and with yes, all this information. So yes, I also liked what you said about the yes, about these data sets. And I mean, I want to say that having all this information together brings us to the importance of having data sets and having the information well managed, well shared, and also even the existing buildings as the main source of building materials, which yes, it's all that I.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you made a good point there, Bethany, that, you know, really that's why platforms like Share Your Green Design are so important, really, because they allow us kind of publicize this information for everybody's benefit, and bring people from different disciplines together to understand different strategies and different approaches to creating green building designs.
Exactly, and also having the information not only available but also simplified, so it has a broader access. That's also very important, not staying in silos.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. So we have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, what would be the most effective policy to reduce the embodied carbon of the large quantities of new housing required in Ireland and almost in every country worldwide?
Well, that's a good question, and I suppose not one without an easy answer. I mean, certainly in Ireland we can and we are moving to a lot more bio-based kind of construction, which again is an answer that brings a lot of, you know, is a complex answer really as to the real benefits of producing timber buildings. I mean, it all comes down to their end of life, really. But certainly we can move to more sustainable construction methods like that. But I think the question of how we achieve more sustainable design in housing in Ireland and in the UK and a lot of Europe is oftentimes around the type of housing that we're building. And in Ireland, we're seeing a lot of kind of edge town and edge city development of detached and semi-detached homes that have, very high form factors, lots of areas for heat loss from the building, so operate very poorly. But also when we talk about the embodied carbon of those developments, we're talking about a lot more servicing, a lot more roads around, a lot more area around those homes, a lot more materials added than if we went for denser, kind of more inner city kind of developments linked to public transportation systems. Because by developing on the edge of towns like that, we're locking in carbon for cars and transportation systems like that into the future, and requiring the maintenance of all that infrastructure that's required for those kind of developments into the future. So I think it's a multifaceted kind of solution that's required.
Yes, absolutely. Also, sometimes we comment when we are on our chats in Share Green Design, for example, about how to measure the things and how the measurement gives you a path or another one. And for instance, we always measure embodied carbon or carbon in general per meter square. We don't measure it per person. So it doesn't account for having a huge home or having a smaller one, which also adds up a lot when we are accounting for everything, for materials, for energy, and yes, the urban size as well. Bigger houses would need more space in the end.
Absolutely, and they it's a lot more volume to heat, and as the temperatures rise, maybe a lot more volume to cool as well into the future. We really need to get a lot more, I think, smart about the type of development that we make is I think what I would propose the key to reducing the overall embodied carbon of the type of construction that we're doing.
Yes, and then that align with other metrics, right? So we can consider that.
Agreed.
So a second question is, do you have a sense of the impact of using low embodied carbon building materials could have on new building and retrofit?
Yeah, sure. I suppose it's quite similar to the first question. I mean, there are huge savings to be made in how we build buildings. Again, I think a big answer to that, or a big solution to that, is the issue of scale. Tackling the issue of scale. I mean, with those buildings that I'm sure.
I think we have lost him. Let's see. He comes back. Yes. Sorry, we lost you for a couple of seconds.
Yeah, apologies. I'm having a bad internet day here, that's for sure. I suppose just making the point that I think in a lot of cases, yes, it's the material for sure, but it's also the scale of buildings that we're building. I mean, particularly when we look at the office buildings that I was showing in Dublin that are being demolished, in most of those cases, what we're seeing is buildings, 3 and 4 times the square area, floor area being built to replace them. So it's not just, I think there's a lot of focus within architecture schools on actually the materiality of these buildings, but it's as much the volume of materials that we use as the materiality. I think the kind of, it's almost like today concrete is a bad word to use, but really it's the quantity of concrete that we use. It's per kilogram of material. It's actually relatively benign, and particularly when we use supplementary cementitious materials and the like. Really, what we need to do is reduce the volume and the inefficient kind of construction methods that we're using currently.
Yes. And also about the sources of these materials, right? Because we can think about more efficient materials that individually, if we account for them, in the calculations, they are really good. But then what's the availability of those materials and what are the impacts of a massive scale for harvesting those materials? And biodiversity impacts of that as well, and where they are coming from,
Yeah.
etc. So,
Absolutely. You know, like a material like hemp, and we've done a lot of work with hemp here in my research group. We do a lot of thermal testing of it. We do a lot of acoustic testing of it. It's a super material. But like we live in a country where very few skilled labourers exist to build hemp buildings. We don't have a hemp processing plant. We don't produce much hemp in the country. So as great a material as it is, the systems aren't really in place to use it widely. I mean, I still think it's a super material. Plan to use it in my own home, but you know, it's not going to build the amount of housing that we need to build between now and 2030 on to 2040, etc.
Yes, exactly. Okay, another one. Have you done any research about overheating issues in highly insulated homes over the summer period, and how could it be overcome?
Yes, we have, and I have a PhD student who should be tuned in to the presentation currently. Fahima is doing really good work on overheating with our local council here, looking at a large data set of buildings. And a colleague of mine, Shane Coakley, who should make a shout out to, he's also publishing a paper, I think, on passive house homes, where we are seeing high levels of overheating in those homes. So in homes that are retrofit to very high energy rating levels, A standard and stuff, we do see overheating in the summer months. Even in Ireland, where the climate, you know, it never reaches very high temperatures for very, very long periods of the summer. Certainly not in our standard summers. So yes is the answer to the question.
And do you think this the reason of this overheating is mainly coming from design, or can it be from the user and how the building is used?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I think it's both, and I think there's huge potential there, really, to try and. I think a place we need to move to is actually educating people in how to operate their homes most efficiently. I mean, it's standard practice, really, to go in and for councils, say, to go into a scheme of social housing, retrofit that building, but never kind of disseminate you know, the optimum strategies for operation of that building back to the users. So we see people, you know, using their ventilation systems incorrectly. Certainly we see people using, say, their heating technologies incorrectly, as we've moved from, you know, from very different heating systems, say from oil-fired boilers to heat pump systems, you know, where temperatures and radiators are gone from 80 degrees to 40 degrees, and people just don't know how to operate those systems. And we need to kind of educate homeowners at that handover stage so that we really achieve the benefits of these kind of systems in use.
Yes, totally agree. Okay, next one. Given the performance gaps that are being exhibited by heat pumps and the 680,000 that are needed by 2030, is there another measure that we could further encourage during deep retrofitting in the near future? Something that could be further encouraged to make up for this gap?
I mean, yes, I think is the answer. I do think that the heat pump technology is a really good solution. I'm very worried about the kind of the scale of rollout of it in a very short time period, with very little testing of its performance in situ. I mean, if you look at the academic literature, which is usually a good quantifier, there are almost just a handful of papers that have actually looked at the operation of heat pumps in homes. And as I say, and I said in my presentation, many of those are showing underperformance. It's for a range of reasons. A lot of them are installation reasons. So again, it comes back to education of installers, you know, so that we don't install heat pumps with long pipe lengths where there's lots of paths for heat loss between the system and the emitter within the building. It's mismatching of heat pump size with emitters within the building. So we're seeing a lot of that at the moment. We need a lot more kind of guidance for installers on what size of heat pump needs to be installed for what kind of heating system, be it radiators, underfloor heating, the scale of it. So I think there's lots of easy wins with regard to heat pumps. And I really do think it can be a great technology into the future, there, you know, that we are gaining from it currently, and as we decarbonize our electricity grid, we're gaining from it. We just need to learn a lot more about how to operate it most efficiently, I think.
And do you think we are running behind with the knowledge of how to install this equipment as well? Like, do we have enough people trained to meet these targets?
No, not nearly enough. Not even a fraction of enough people trained. You know, to particularly to carry out these kind of huge rollouts. You know, 680,000.
Let's see if he connects again.
Hello?
Yes, now we're back.
Yeah, I say, particularly for these kind of mass market rollouts, we don't have nearly enough qualified installers, and we don't have nearly enough centres where these people can be qualified. We have added some new centres of excellence in Ireland for NZEBs and the technologies related to NZEBs, which are a great addition, but we need a lot more, and we need a lot more people taking up that training.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask you the last question. We have more questions in the chats that you might be able to go through and probably respond them.
Happy to do that.
What provision, this is related to the previous one, what provision is there for upskilling and training on building physics within the supply chain in Ireland whilst the national retrofit scheme is being rolled out?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm not sure of the full range of offerings, but I mean, you know, there are a number of initiatives run by the Irish Green Building Council who are very much, you know, I think it's called their Rebuild project. They're looking at the kind of the gap in knowledge and the gap in education that's required to supply that knowledge. SkillsNet program is also linked to the construction industries, trying to identify those gaps. I mean, as I say, the centres of excellence that have been set up around the country, one in Mount Lucas, one in Waterford, I think there's another one elsewhere, really great places. I went myself and did a day course on NZEB retrofit before last Christmas, and learned a lot in the one day. You know, this is kind of building physics kind of for the construction practitioner or construction professional. It's you know, I think that's kind of what we need is kind of education for the construction sector that's really accessible and understandable. I mean, in the universities, we're trying to do our bit. As I say, we have our masters, and building physics is a big part of that. And here in the School of Architecture and across all schools of architecture in Ireland, we're trying to revise the curriculum. We're funded by the government here in Ireland to revise the curriculum, embed climate science, building physics, circular economy, embodied carbon kind of themes within the curriculum to try and train architects of the future in all of these kind of concepts.
That sounds really exciting. And yeah, it's also really exciting to see all the broad research that you have been working on, and you are working on, and this large team of experts you work with. So yes, please keep sending that piece of research to us. We're very happy to share them in our platforms, in our social media. So yes, thank you very much once again for joining us today and sharing all this very valuable information. Thanks everyone for the great questions and for joining this Share Your Green Design Masterclass. This session will be posted online, so check our website, shareyourgreendesign.com, and subscribe to our channels to keep up with this and other content that we are constantly sharing, such as the latest projects, news, research, but even events, competition, and student work and job adverts as well. Also, if you have projects you want to share in our platform, please get in touch with us. We even have a section dedicated to student projects and research. And if you have any comments, ideas, or just want to collaborate with us, please get in touch as well. So thanks everyone, and see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.